In the dead of night, a Navy SEAL enters a silent port, hiding a weapon that makes no sound. At his side is a loyal K-9, trained to obey, until instinct tells him something is wrong. They discover a woman chained to the device, and she knows the SEAL by name. Command orders him to walk away and leave her behind. As a cargo ship approaches, the K-9 refuses to move, forcing a choice no training prepared him for. What follows is not an explosion, but a quiet act of mercy the world will never know. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, tell us where you are and subscribe to Angels in Uniform. Ethan Cole? Mercer knew the night would not end like the others long before a single order reached his ear. It was not the sea, though the water lay unnaturally flat, black as polished stone. It was not the absence of moonlight, though the sky offered no stars, no comfort, no witnesses. It was the silence inside his chest, the way his breathing slowed without effort, the way his pulse dropped into a calm that only arrived when something irreversible was waiting ahead. Ethan had learned, over years of night insertions and unfinished prayers, that his body always recognized those moments first. He surfaced without splash, broad shoulders cutting the water cleanly, his build still lean and disciplined despite the weight of gear pressing against him. At 35, Ethan carried the quiet hardness of someone who had lived too long with responsibility. His face, angular and weathered by salt and sun, bore a faint scar through the left eyebrow, a pale line from a past mission that no one in command ever mentioned anymore. A short, untrimmed beard shadowed his jaw, not from neglect but habit. It kept people from asking unnecessary questions. His eyes, blue-gray and steady, reflected nothing of the water ahead. Rex followed him ashore without command. The 6-year-old German shepherd moved with controlled precision, black and tan coat darkened by seawater, muscles coiled beneath wet fur. His amber eyes scanned the shoreline not with fear, but judgment. Rex was not aggressive by nature. He was deliberate. Years of work had refined his instincts into something closer to discernment than reaction. A faint scar marked his left shoulder, old and healed, but the dog favored it slightly when standing still, a reminder of loyalty paid in flesh. His black tactical harness clung tightly to his frame, unadorned, functional, as stripped of excess as the man beside him. Behind Ethan, the rest of the SEAL team emerged in practiced silence. Hawk, the breacher and second in command, was first after Rex, thick-necked and broad-chested, his presence filling space even when he tried to disappear. Hawk believed in orders the way some men believed in gravity. Unquestionable, unforgiving, necessary. Ghostline took position farther back, tall and narrow, face unreadable beneath low light, already calculating angles and shadows. Doc followed, average in build, eyes softer than the others, the kind of man who carried grief quietly and remembered every life he could not save. Switch came last, compact and efficient, his movements precise, a man more comfortable listening to signals than voices. The command in Ethan's ear arrived clean and cold. Recover the device, exfiltrate without trace, no engagement, no delay. No one asked what the device was. They never did. Questions were for daylight, for debriefing rooms, for men who slept through the night. The container sat alone at the edge of the abandoned port, steel walls stained with rust and salt. No guards, no lights, no sign of recent activity. Rex stopped several feet from the door. He did not growl. He did not lower his stance. He simply stood still, ears forward, breathing shallow. Ethan felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs. Rex never froze without reason. The door opened with a controlled hiss, metal protesting softly. Inside, the air was colder than expected, The first thing Ethan noticed was the light, a faint blue pulse emanating from a metal case the size of a carry-on suitcase. It blinked slowly, rhythmically, like something alive. The second thing he noticed was the woman. She was seated on the floor, wrists restrained by heavy cuffs, chains running not to the wall but to the device itself. She appeared to be in her early 30s, slim to the point of fragility. Her posture slumped not from weakness, but exhaustion. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh light, marked by old bruises fading into yellow and gray. Dark brown hair, once carefully kept, now hung loosely at her shoulders, tied back with a fraying band as if she had stopped caring weeks ago. When she looked up, her eyes were deep-set and tired, but alert, carrying a weight that suggested long nights without sleep and longer days without forgiveness. She looked directly at Ethan, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. "You're still alive," she said softly, her voice steady despite the chains. Ethan did not answer. His body went still, the way it always did when memory brushed too close. Rex stepped forward, nose low, scenting the air around the device, then the woman. His posture changed. Not alarm, recognition. He turned his head toward Ethan, eyes locking with his handlers. The device was not merely near her, it was integrated into her. Sensors, lines, something beneath the fabric of her coat that Rex could smell but not name. Switch whispered, "If that thing activates, there won't be an explosion." Doc swallowed. No sound, no fire, just sickness moving through people like breath. Hawk's jaw tightened. "We take the device. Orders are clear." The woman spoke again, her gaze never leaving Ethan. "I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you not to let others die because of me." Ethan glanced down at Rex. The dog had positioned himself beside the woman, close but not touching, as if standing guard. Rex had been trained to alert, to engage, to withdraw. This quiet decision to stay was not training. The voice from command returned, distant and detached. "Priority is the device. The witness is non-essential." Ethan reached up and removed his earpiece. The small click sounded louder than the sea. A third of the way through the operation, something shifted. Rex suddenly lifted his head and stared at the woman, then pressed his forehead gently against her knee. It was an untrained behavior, something he had never done on mission. The woman's breath caught. She hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on his neck. Her shoulders trembled once, just once. Ethan felt it then, unmistakably, a tightening behind his eyes, a memory he had buried, stirring awake. "If you had arrived earlier," she said quietly, "would she still be alive?" Ethan's hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing the worn edge of a small bracelet he carried everywhere. He did not ask who she meant. "I was the last one she called," he said, his voice low, almost lost to the container walls. "Before I closed the operating room door." No one spoke. Even Hawk said nothing. Switch's voice broke the silence. "A cargo ship just changed course. 38 minutes until it docks. Once it does, there will be people everywhere." Rex stiffened. A sharp sound cracked through the air as a structural brace shifted under pressure. Rex lunged forward, placing his body between Ethan and the device, just as Doc shouted his name. The blue light quickened, time compressed. Ethan knew that if they left now, the world would never know how close it came to disaster. If they stayed, none of them were guaranteed to leave. He looked at Rex, then at the woman. "We take everything," he said. "All of it." The order hung in the air, heavy and final. As Rex collapsed from the impact, Doc rushed forward, hands already working, while the device's pulse accelerated. Somewhere deep in Ethan's chest, something long asleep opened its eyes. If this story touched something inside you, if you believe that even in the darkest silence, God still works through ordinary people, please like, share, and comment below. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can continue telling stories of quiet courage, faith, and the small miracles that keep the world turning. The device did not hum louder as time passed. It did something far worse. It remained calm. The blue pulse continued at the same patient rhythm, indifferent to the urgency gathering in the container and the shallow breathing of the woman chained beside it. Ethan Cole Mercer had faced explosives before, pressure plates buried under sand, vests wired to shaking hands. But those devices announced themselves through fear. This one did not. It waited. That waiting unsettled him more than any ticking clock. Doc knelt beside Rex, hands steady despite the dog's labored breaths. The medic was a man in his early 40s, compact with tired eyes that carried the soft weight of too many goodbyes. His dark hair was clipped short, regulation clean, but his face was permanently lined by concern. He worked with quiet competence, fingers checking the shepherd's ribs and shoulder where the impact had landed. Rex's amber eyes tracked Ethan even as Doc applied pressure and murmured reassurance. The dog did not whine. He endured. Switch crouched near the device, his movements careful, almost reverent. He was younger than the others, early 30s, with a narrow build and an analytical gaze that rarely lingered on faces. His world was signals and patterns. "It's not a bomb in the way we're used to," he said softly. "No blast radius, no fire. It's a dispersal system. Once it's active, people don't even realize what's happening. They walk, they breathe, they touch. Then days later, hospitals fill up." He paused, eyes flicking to the woman. "And no one can trace it back." Hawk stood watch near the door, shoulders squared, jaw tight. He was tall and broad, his beard trimmed short, his expression carved by years of believing that discipline was the only thing standing between order and chaos. "Then we do exactly what command said," he replied. "We take the device, we leave. Every extra minute here is another risk." Ethan said nothing. He watched Rex, then the woman, then the device that linked them. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her position on the floor. She was not crying. She looked past the men, past the metal walls, as if remembering something that could not be unremembered. Her posture suggested resignation rather than fear, the posture of someone who had already lost every argument with herself. "My name doesn't matter," she said quietly, answering a question no one had asked. Her voice was clear, almost clinical, as if she had practiced speaking without emotion. "What matters is that this thing was designed to move through people who will never know they carried it. Children, elderly, anyone who stands in line at the wrong time." She glanced at Ethan. "It doesn't explode. It erases." Ethan felt the word settle in his chest. Erase. He had seen erasure before. Names struck from reports, faces blurred in memory, a life reduced to a folded flag, and a sentence that began with regret to inform you. He turned his attention to Hawk. "If this activates on a dock full of civilians," he said evenly, "we won't be able to stop what follows. Not here, not anywhere." Hawk's eyes hardened. "That's why we don't wait." The woman inhaled slowly. "I didn't build it to be merciful," she said. "I built it because they told me if I didn't, they would take children who had already disappeared and make sure no one ever found them." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I signed the orders. I told myself I was saving someone by condemning others. Switch stiffened. There are records, he said. Digital shadows. Authorizations that rerouted aid convoys. After that, camps went dark. Entire lists of miners were closed. He looked up, conflicted. They forced your signature. They held my hands, she replied. But they didn't force my pen. Rex stirred at the sound of her voice and lifted his head. Despite the pain, he pressed closer to her knee again, his breathing evening out in her presence. Doc noticed it too. He's calmer with her, the medic said under his breath. Heart rate drops every time. Ethan felt a tightening behind his eyes. Rex trusted few people without cause. The dog had been trained to read danger, to respond to threat, not to comfort strangers. Yet here he was, choosing proximity over protection. Ethan wondered if trust could exist even in people who had done unforgivable things. As the team debated in hushed tones, Rex suddenly turned his head toward the far wall and let out a low, sustained whine, soft, almost mournful. The sound was not an alert. It was something else. Ethan followed the dog's gaze to a rusted section of steel where faint scratches marked the surface, crude lines carved by a small object. They formed uneven shapes, counted marks like days crossed off. The woman noticed too. Her composure cracked for the first time. They kept time for the children that way, she whispered, so they wouldn't forget how long they'd been gone. Rex's whine stopped. He rested his chin on her knee, as if acknowledging a truth spoken aloud. In that moment, the container felt less like a holding cell and more like a confession booth. And Ethan felt the weight of judgment shift from heaven to the floor beneath them. The radio crackled with a distant update. Cargo vessel altered course, command reported. Estimated dock time 30 minutes. Hawk exhaled sharply. That's our window closing. Ethan finally spoke. If we remove the device without her, what happens? Switch hesitated. It goes dormant, not neutralized. It can be reactivated elsewhere, and if she dies, we lose the only biometric key that shuts it down fully. Doc looked up from Rex. And the dog doesn't make it if we rush extraction under fire. Silence pressed in again. Ethan weighed the options, not as a soldier, but as a man who had learned that doing the right thing often looked like disobedience. He met the woman's eyes. Why did you say you knew I was alive? She swallowed. Because years ago, there was a report, she said. A name crossed my screen. You were listed as killed in action. I prayed it wasn't true. She paused. I don't pray much anymore. Hawk turned away, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. Ghostline shifted position, rifle steady, scanning shadows. No one spoke the obvious truth. That faith had a way of resurfacing when everything else failed. Ethan made his decision. We move together, he said. The device and the witness, quietly, slowly. Hawk faced him. You're gambling lives. Ethan nodded. I know. They began to prepare for movement, adjusting straps, redistributing weight. Doc fashioned a support sling for Rex, who accepted it without complaint, eyes never leaving Ethan's face. The woman rose unsteadily, chains clinking softly as Switch worked to detach the device enough to allow mobility without triggering activation. Outside, the distant groan of a ship's horn echoed faintly across the water. As they moved toward the exit, the blue light pulsed on, steady and indifferent, a reminder that the worst weapons were often the quietest. Ethan took one last look at the scratches on the wall and whispered a prayer he had not spoken in years. Not for success, but for mercy. If you believe that even silent dangers can be stopped by courage and faith, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can keep telling stories of miracles that happen not with noise, but with conviction and grace. The night did not move forward so much as it closed in. After the decision was made to move together, time seemed to thicken, every second stretching under the weight of what they carried. The woman rose slowly, chains clinking as Switch worked to stabilize the device against her body. Up close, Ethan could see the fine tremor in her hands. Not fear, but exhaustion layered with resolve. Her frame was slim, almost fragile beneath the oversized gray coat. Yet there was a steadiness in her posture that suggested she had been holding herself upright for a very long time. Her skin was pale, stretched thin by sleepless nights, and faint lines marked the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from vigilance. When she met Ethan's gaze, there was recognition there, but also restraint, as if she were afraid of what memory might say out loud. Switch finished adjusting the rig and leaned back. "This is as good as it gets," he said quietly. "The system reads her vitals constantly. Heart rate, temperature, blood chemistry. If any of it drops outside the window, the device assumes compromise." He glanced at Ethan, "And once it locks, it won't unlock again. Not ever." Hawk's jaw tightened. "So she's the key." "She's the lock," Switch corrected. "Alive." Doc shifted the sling supporting Rex, checked the bandage on the dog's shoulder. Rex, 6 years old and still powerfully built despite the injury, endured the pain with quiet dignity. His black and tan coat was streaked with dried salt, his amber eyes alert but soft when they returned to Ethan. The dog's breathing remained uneven, but calmer than before, especially when the woman was near. Doc noticed it again and frowned slightly. "He stabilizes around her," he murmured. "Like his system recognizes something safe." Ethan absorbed the words without comment. He had learned not to argue with Rex's instincts. They had saved his life more times than training manuals ever could. As they began moving through the narrow service corridor leading away from the container, the woman spoke again, her voice low, careful not to carry. "You should know the truth before we go any farther." She paused, searching Ethan's face. "If I die, even accidentally, the device cannot be fully shut down. It can be delayed, buried, hidden, but not neutralized." Her eyes flicked briefly to Hawk. "I wasn't designed to be expendable." Hawk stopped walking. "That wasn't in the briefing." "No," she replied evenly, "because the people who built this didn't want anyone believing I was necessary. They wanted an object, not a conscience." The corridor opened briefly to a broken loading bay. Moonless light filtered in through shattered concrete, casting long shadows across the ground. Ghost lines signaled from ahead, a silent gesture indicating movement beyond the port fence. The cargo ship's horn sounded again, louder now, closer. The world was waking up. Ethan felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the mission. He studied the woman more closely. There was intelligence in the way she listened, a scientist's attention, but also something heavier, guilt that had settled deep enough to become part of her posture. "You said you knew I was alive," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Why?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Rex carefully as Doc adjusted the sling again. Rex lifted his head, gave a short, almost questioning sound, then rested his chin against Ethan's knee. The contact was brief, grounding. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I read your name years ago," she said at last, "in a casualty update, listed as killed during a coastal extraction." She swallowed. "I remember feeling relief, and then shame for feeling it. Because if you were dead, it meant someone else had survived." Hawk exhaled sharply, but said nothing. That wasn't the first time I prayed, she continued. But it was the first time I prayed for a stranger. They resumed moving. The corridor sloped downward, water pooling underfoot. Ethan's mind drifted despite himself, pulled backward by her words. He had been late once, not minutes, hours. Weather delays, miscommunication, a chain of decisions that looked reasonable on paper. By the time he arrived, the operating room door was already closing. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, the harsh lights, the way his hands shook when he reached the hallway. The memory surfaced fully now, uninvited. I was the last person she called, Ethan said, his voice barely above a breath. Before I closed the operating room door. The words hung between them, fragile and irreversible. The woman stopped walking. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if something inside her had finally been named. Then you know, she said, what it feels like to arrive when faith has already left the room. No one spoke. Even Hawk looked away. At that moment, Rex suddenly pulled against the sling with surprising strength, letting out a short, urgent bark that echoed off the concrete. It was not alarm. It was insistence. Ethan turned just in time to see a faint red indicator flicker on the device, then vanish. Switch swore under his breath. That shouldn't happen, he said. It responded to her stress spike. Then it corrected itself. He stared at the readout. It's almost like it chose not to trigger. The woman closed her eyes, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear. When she opened them again, there were tears there. Not of fear, but of something closer to relief. Sometimes, she said softly, mercy doesn't come from design. The corridors seemed to breathe with them, and for a fleeting second, Ethan wondered if Rex had sensed something beyond data, something like grace. The ship's horn sounded again, now impossibly close. Switch checked his tablet. 10 minutes until docking. Ghost Line's voice crackled softly through the comms. Perimeter lights coming on. Hawk stepped forward, urgency returning. We're out of time. Ethan nodded. He felt the familiar weight of command settle back into place, but it was different now, threaded with memory and consequence. We move, he said. Quiet. Together. As they advanced toward the extraction point, the woman steadied herself, breathing in time with the blue pulse at her side. Rex limped but stayed upright, eyes fixed forward. The key was still breathing, and as long as it did, there was a chance. Not for redemption, perhaps, but for restraint. If this chapter moved you, if you believe that even broken people can still be instruments of God's mercy, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can continue telling stories where faith, sacrifice, and quiet miracles walk side by side. The port no longer slept. Floodlights flickered on one by one along the distant docks, their pale cones of light cutting through mist and darkness, turning shadows into sharp-edged threats. Engines rumbled somewhere beyond the fence, and the low metallic groan of the cargo ship settling into berth vibrated faintly through the concrete beneath their boots. The world was returning, indifferent to the fragile line the team was walking. Ethan felt it immediately. The shift in pressure, the way missions changed when civilians were about to enter the equation. Violence became louder then. Consequences heavier. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, the familiar weight grounding him as Rex limped at his side, supported by the sling Doc had improvised. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow but steady, his black and tan coat darkened by blood and seawater. At 6 years old, Rex was no longer reckless, but his loyalty remained absolute. His amber eyes never stopped searching Ethan's face, as if waiting for confirmation that staying had been the right choice. The woman walked between Ethan and Switch, chains now shortened and controlled, the device secured against her torso. Under the harsh floodlights, her face looked even more drawn, cheekbones sharp, skin pale to the point of translucence. Yet her posture was upright. There was a strange calm in her movements, the calm of someone who had already accepted judgment and was simply waiting for the sentence. Her dark hair clung to her temples with sweat, and when she spoke, it was without tremor. "They won't let this go," she said quietly. "They never do." The radio crackled. Command's voice came through, distant, filtered, almost disembodied. Rules of engagement updated. If containment risk exceeds acceptable parameters, authorization granted to neutralize the witness. The words landed like a physical blow. Hawk stopped walking. He turned slowly, his broad face rigid, eyes hard under the helmet. Years of service had etched certainty into his features. He was a man who had learned that hesitation killed more people than obedience ever did. "You heard that," he said to Ethan. "This just became clean." Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at the woman. She met his gaze steadily, then nodded once. "He's right," she said. "You should leave me here. If they take me back, I won't survive long anyway." She glanced at Rex, then back at Ethan. "At least this way. The device never leaves the port." Doc shook his head slightly, lips pressed thin. Switch stared at his tablet, jaw clenched, as if numbers might absolve him of the choice unfolding. Ghostline remained in overwatch position, silent, his rifle steady, but his posture tense. Hawk stepped closer to Ethan, lowering his voice. "You're not thinking straight. This is distance talking. Command sees the whole board. We see one square." Ethan finally spoke. "Command sees from thousands of miles away," he said evenly. "They don't hear breathing. They don't see blood." Hawk's eyes flashed. "And you think you do? You think carrying that thing into a populated area is mercy?" His voice cracked slightly despite himself. "I've buried teammates because someone wanted to feel righteous." The woman stepped forward before Ethan could respond. "I will stay," she said clearly. "I will sit right here. You can chain me back to the container." Her gaze softened when it fell on Rex. "You can save him." Rex let out a low sound, something between a whine and a growl, and shifted his weight painfully, placing himself squarely between the woman and Ethan. His body trembled with effort, but his stance was unmistakable, guarding. Ethan felt something break inside his chest, not loudly, not cleanly, but like a seam giving way under strain. He remembered the operating room again, the white doors, the silence after the machine stopped, the knowledge that obedience had been the safer choice, and the guilt that followed anyway. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried. Hawk stared at him. "That's an order." Ethan shook his head. "It's a suggestion. From people who won't be here when this ends." The radio crackled again, sharper now. "Confirm compliance." Ethan reached up and turned the volume down, not off, but low enough that it no longer dominated the moment. "We move," he said. "Now." They advanced toward the extraction route, the distance to the perimeter shrinking with every step. Shouts echoed somewhere to their left. Flashlights cut through the mist. Someone had seen something. The port was waking fully now, noise bleeding into every corner. A sudden crack split the air. Not a gunshot, metal tearing. A crane arm shifted above them, its massive silhouette groaning as a cable snapped loose and whipped downward. Instinct took over. Rex surged forward with a strength that surprised everyone, throwing his body into Ethan's legs just as the cable slammed into the ground where Ethan had stood a second earlier. The impact sent Rex skidding across the concrete. Doc shouted his name. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the dog, hands slick with blood. Rex's chest heaved, his eyes glassy but focused, tail giving a faint, stubborn thump against the ground. In that instant, under flickering lights and falling debris, Ethan felt something unmistakable, an overwhelming certainty that Rex had not moved by chance. Hawk covered the perimeter, firing controlled shots to drive approaching figures back. Ghost Line provided overwatch, his calm voice calling distances and angles. Switch worked frantically to stabilize the device as the woman knelt beside Rex, her hands hovering, afraid to touch. "He chose you," she whispered to Ethan. "Some things still choose." Ethan lifted Rex's head gently, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "Stay with me," he murmured. "You don't get to quit now." Sirens wailed in the distance. The cargo ship's engines powered down, the sound final and ominous. Time had run out for clean exits. Hawk looked back at Ethan, conflict raging across his face. "We can still leave him," he said, though the words lacked conviction now. Ethan met his gaze. "We don't." They moved again. Slower now, heavier, carrying Rex between them, the device pulsing steadily against the woman's chest. The port roared around them, lights blazing, voices shouting, chaos blooming like a storm. Yet within that noise, Ethan felt a strange stillness settle over him. The kind that came when a choice was finally made, and all that remained was to live with it. If this chapter stirred your heart, if you believe that God sometimes speaks through sacrifice and loyalty, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform to continue walking with stories of faith, courage, and the quiet miracles that follow those who refuse to walk away. The extraction route narrowed into a service tunnel that smelled of rust and salt water. The kind of place never meant for people, only pipes and forgotten cables. Floodlights from the port bled weakly into the entrance behind them. But ahead, there was only darkness and the sound of Rex's labored breathing echoing off concrete walls. Ethan moved at the front now, rifle lowered but ready, every step measured, every sense stretched thin. The world had shrunk to a corridor, a wounded dog, a woman carrying a quiet catastrophe, and a choice that no training had prepared him for. Doc knelt again beside Rex when they reached a momentary pocket of cover. The medic's hands were steady, but his face had changed. The softness was still there, but it was edged now with the gravity of someone about to speak a truth that could not be taken back. He was a man in his early 40s, dark hair cropped short, beard just beginning to gray along his jawline. Years of patching bodies under fire had taught him when hope was honest and when it was cruel. "Ethan," Doc said quietly, eyes never leaving Rex's chest as it rose and fell unevenly. "I need you to hear this." Ethan crouched beside them, one hand resting on Rex's neck, feeling the warmth still there, the pulse still fighting. Rex's amber eyes met his, clouded with pain but unwavering, tail giving a faint, stubborn twitch against the concrete, as if to say he was still here, still working. Doc took a breath. "The device, it has a failsafe, not the kind they put in manuals, a human one." He glanced toward the woman, who stood a few feet away, supported lightly by Switch. If the biometric key holder's vitals flatline in a controlled sequence, the system interprets it as a terminal breach. It shuts itself down permanently. Hawk swore under his breath. Ghostline stiffened, but said nothing. Switch looked up sharply, eyes wide. "You're saying if she dies, it ends," Doc finished. "No reactivation, no relocation, No second chance. The words settled heavily in the tunnel. The woman straightened, shoulders squaring despite exhaustion. In the harsh half-light, she looked smaller than before, almost fragile. Yet there was a resolve in her posture that had not been there earlier. Her pale face was calm, eyes clear. "Then that's it," she said. "That's what I was made for." Ethan turned to her sharply. "No." She met his gaze steadily. "You don't get to decide that alone." Her voice was gentle, not defiant. "I signed papers that erased children. I told myself it was survival. This," she gestured weakly toward the device at her chest, "this is accountability." Hawk stepped closer, voice low but urgent. "This ends the mission cleanly. No fallout, no pursuit, no civilian risk." He hesitated, then added, "And it saves the dog." Ethan felt the weight of that last sentence, like a blade. He looked down at Rex, who shifted slightly closer, pressing his head into Ethan's thigh despite the pain. The dog's loyalty was not abstract. It was physical, breathing, bleeding. The woman knelt beside Rex slowly, carefully, as if afraid of causing more harm. She extended her hand, stopping just short of touching him. Rex lifted his head with effort and nudged her fingers once, gently. Her breath hitched. "He forgives easier than we do," she whispered. Ethan's mind reeled backward again, unbidden. The operating room, the woman on the table, the flat tone of the monitor when it was too late. He remembered choosing procedure over instinct, obedience over interruption. He had lived with that choice every day since, convincing himself it had been necessary, unavoidable. And yet, here it was again, wearing a different face, asking the same question. The woman looked up at him. "Let me do this," she said softly. "Let me be the last bad thing this device ever touches." As if sensing the weight of the moment, Rex suddenly lifted his head higher than he had since the injury and let out a single, low sound. Not a bark, not a whine, but something in between. His eyes moved from Ethan to the woman and back again. Then, with visible effort, he shifted his body so that his injured side faced away from her, placing himself between her and Ethan once more. The message was unmistakable. Not protection. Refusal. Ethan felt a chill move through him, a quiet certainty blooming beneath the fear. Mercy, he realized, was not always about endings. Sometimes it was about endurance. "No," Ethan said again, louder now. He rose to his feet. "We're not doing this." Hawk stared at him. "You're condemning yourself?" Ethan nodded. "I know." He turned to Switch. "There's another way." Switch frowned. "We ran every scenario." "Not everyone," Ethan replied. He reached into an inner pocket and withdrew a small, worn object. A bracelet, frayed and old, etched with a sequence of numbers so faded they were almost invisible. "I was part of a joint oversight op years ago," he continued. "Black channel, emergency containment codes, never logged, never acknowledged." He looked at the woman. "You would have seen them, buried deep." Her eyes widened slowly. "The Mercy Protocol?" she breathed. "They told us it was a myth." "They tell people a lot of things," Ethan said. Switch took the bracelet with trembling hands, scanning the etched pattern, fingers flying over his tablet. "If this works," he said, voice barely controlled, "Command will see an anomaly. They'll know someone intervened." Ethan met his gaze. "That's fine." The woman closed her eyes as Switch initiated the sequence, breathing shallowly as the blue pulse quickened, then faltered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light dimmed. Once, twice, and went dark. Silence fell, true silence this time, heavy and complete. Doc exhaled a breath he had been holding far too long. He checked Rex, again, relief flickering across his face. "He's stabilizing," he said quietly. "Still critical, but alive." The woman sagged forward, catching herself on her hands. Tears slid down her cheeks now, unchecked, not of fear or guilt, but of survival. "You didn't let me disappear," she said hoarsely. Ethan looked at her, then at Rex, then at the darkened device. "Living with what we've done," he said, "is sometimes harder than dying for it." Sirens grew louder outside the tunnel. Time pressed in again. Hawk shook his head slowly, a grim half-smile touching his lips. "You just rewrote your life," he said. Ethan did not argue. If this chapter moved you, if you believe that God's greatest miracles sometimes come through restraint rather than sacrifice, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can continue telling stories where mercy costs more, but saves more. Morning arrived without ceremony. There were no headlines, no alarms, no visible gratitude from a world that had come dangerously close to unraveling and never knew it. The port was sealed and scrubbed. The tunnel collapsed behind a curtain of official explanations, and by the time the sun climbed high enough to burn the mist from the water, the operation already belonged to paperwork and silence. Ethan Cole Mercer stood alone on the edge of the temporary forward base, helmet off, salt still crusted into the seams of his gear. In daylight, his face looked older than it had the night before. The sharp angles of his jaw were unchanged, the short beard still rough against his skin. But the steadiness in his eyes had been replaced by something heavier. Acceptance without relief. He had not slept. He had not expected to. Doing the right thing, he was learning, did not bring rest. Rex lay on a canvas stretcher a few meters away, IV lines taped neatly into his foreleg. The German shepherd's black and tan coat had been cleaned, but the bandage around his shoulder was thick and stark against the fur. At 6 years old, Rex had been through enough operations to understand routines. He lay still, breathing shallow but regular, ears lifting faintly at distant sounds. His amber eyes followed Ethan whenever he moved. They were quieter now, dulled not by pain alone, but by fatigue, the kind that reached into bone. Doc emerged from the medical tent, sleeves rolled up, dark circles carved beneath his eyes. He was gentle by habit, but today his posture carried the stiffness of restraint. "He's stable," he said, nodding toward Rex. "But his shoulder won't be the same. He'll walk, he'll run. But combat work, that's done." Ethan absorbed the words without visible reaction. He knelt beside Rex and rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth, the steady beat of life. Rex shifted slightly, pressing into the touch. The bond remained. The function did not. Hawk approached from the operations trailer, helmet tucked under one arm. In daylight, the lines in his face were clearer, creases etched by years of decisions made quickly and lived with slowly. He did not look angry now. He looked tired. "Debriefs in 10, he said. "Command patched in." Ethan nodded and rose. The debrief room was small, utilitarian, walls bare except for a single flag. The faces on the screen were distant, clean, untouched by the night. Voices were measured, controlled. The words came carefully. Unauthorized protocol activation. Deviation from mission parameters. Emotional interference. No one raised their voice. No one congratulated them either. When it ended, there was no applause, no commendation. Just a final line added to Ethan's record, stamped in digital ink, psychological override, flag for review. Outside, Switch leaned against a crate. Tablet dark, jaw set. He was younger than Ethan by a few years, lean and sharp-featured, his hair perpetually out of place despite regulations. "They won't say it out loud," he said quietly, "but they know what you did." Ethan met his gaze. "Good." Ghostline passed by without stopping, offering a brief nod, his expression unreadable. Hawk lingered a moment longer. "You didn't make it easy," he said, "but you made it count." Then he turned away, already pulling distance between himself and a decision he would carry in a different way. The woman was gone by noon. There were no records of her transfer, no signatures, no trail to follow. The space she had occupied, physically and morally, collapsed inward the moment she disappeared. Ethan felt it like the sudden absence of weight after carrying something heavy for too long. He wondered if she would sleep now. He wondered if she would pray again. He did not try to find her. In the quiet after the debrief, Ethan returned to Rex. He crouched, raised 2 fingers, and gave the smallest of signals. A command so subtle it barely counted as movement. Rex did not respond. The dog's ears twitched, but his body remained still. Ethan tried again, softer this time. Nothing. A flicker of panic rose uninvited. He swallowed and lowered himself fully to the ground, one knee touching the concrete, then the other. He bowed his head until it rested against Rex's chest. "It's okay," he whispered, voice breaking despite himself. "You don't have to work anymore." Rex exhaled slowly, then nudged Ethan's shoulder with his nose, just once. The signal was gone. The bond remained. In that quiet exchange, Ethan felt the true cost settle into place. Not loss, but change. The team dispersed over the next hours. Assignments reassigned. Flights scheduled. Conversations ended mid-sentence. No one said goodbye properly. There was no ceremony for endings like this. The absence of ritual made it harder. Ethan packed his gear methodically, folding each item with care. He paused over the bracelet, the one with the faded numbers, and slipped it back into his pocket. It was heavier now, though nothing about it had changed. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Ethan sat beside Rex one last time before transport. He traced the edge of the bandage, careful not to disturb it. Rex's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, steady and present. The future was unclear. That too was familiar. He did not know where he would go next, or what shape his days would take without missions to anchor them. He only knew that some nights would be quieter than others, and some silences would ask more of him than gunfire ever had. If this chapter left you quiet, if you believe that God's justice does not always arrive with applause, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform to continue walking with stories where doing right costs more, but still matters. The destruction of the device did not look like justice. There were no flames, no alarms, no moment where the world paused to acknowledge how close it had come to disaster. It happened quietly, deep inside a secure facility whose name would never be written down, where procedures were followed with the precision of men who understood that silence was the final layer of protection. Ethan Cole Mercer watched through a narrow observation window as the casing was separated, the core neutralized, and the remnants sealed into containers marked only by numbers. The blue pulse that had haunted him for days never returned. When it was done, nothing remained that could be photographed, cited, or commemorated. Outside the room, a single official nodded once and turned away. No handshake followed, no words of thanks. The paperwork would say the device had been rendered non-viable. The truth, that it had been stopped by a series of human choices, flawed and costly, would live only in memory. Ethan stepped into the early evening air and felt the weight of it leave his lungs. The sky was a pale wash of gray and blue, the kind that suggested calm without promising it. He removed his gloves slowly, as if the ritual itself mattered. At 35, his posture remained straight, his build still lean and capable. But there was a gentler heaviness to his movements now, the mark of someone who had learned the limits of force. His face, angular and scarred just above the left eyebrow, caught the light, revealing the faint lines etched by sleepless nights. He did not look relieved. He looked resolved. Rex lay on a thick blanket nearby, the German shepherd's black and tan coat brushed clean, the bandage on his shoulder neat and white. At 6 years old, Rex's strength had not left him, but his energy moved differently now, measured and careful. His amber eyes tracked the horizon more than the doorways, as if he understood that danger had passed, but consequences had not. When Ethan approached, Rex lifted his head and thumped his tail once, a restrained greeting that said everything words could not. They were alone together for the first time since the operation ended. The team had scattered quietly, assignments changed, lives resumed. Hawk had left without ceremony, a brief nod the sum of his farewell. Ghostline had disappeared into transit schedules and distance. Doc had stayed long enough to ensure Rex would recover, then left with a promise that felt both sincere and insufficient. Switch had sent one message later that night. They won't talk about it, but they won't forget either. Ethan had not replied. He sat beside Rex and let the silence settle. The sea lay beyond the perimeter fence, smooth and untroubled, its surface reflecting the muted sky. Ethan reached into his pocket and drew out the bracelet. It was old, the leather worn thin, the etched numbers barely legible now. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the familiar grooves, the comfort it had once provided. Slowly, deliberately, he unclasped it and placed it on the ground between himself and Rex. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world did not change. The air did not thicken. Ethan studied the bracelet as if seeing it for the first time, recognizing not just what it represented, but what it had allowed him to carry without confronting. He stood, took a step away, then stopped. He turned back, knelt again, and picked it up. He fastened it around his wrist once more, the leather settling into place like a memory choosing to stay. Some burdens, he realized, were not meant to be set down forever. They were meant to be acknowledged. Rex shifted closer, resting his head against Ethan's thigh. The dog's breathing was even now, steady in a way that felt earned. Ethan rested his hand on Rex's neck and closed his eyes. A breeze moved across the water, cool and unexpected, carrying with it the distant sound of a bell from somewhere beyond the base. Soft, irregular, almost lost to the air. Rex's ears lifted. He raised his head and looked not toward the sound, but at Ethan. His gaze held for several seconds, intent and searching, as if waiting for a signal that never came. Then Rex relaxed again, settling fully against Ethan's leg. Ethan felt a quiet certainty in that exchange, a sense that whatever had followed them this far had finally stopped. Not because it had been defeated, but because it had been witnessed. Later, as the light faded, Ethan walked Rex along the perimeter path. Each step was unhurried. There was no rush now, no clock counting down. The dog moved with care, favoring his shoulder slightly, but he did not falter. The sea was calm, its surface unbroken, the kind of calm that invited reflection rather than vigilance. Ethan stopped near the water and stood there, letting the horizon draw his thoughts outward. He thought of the woman whose name he still did not know, of the way she had stood when given the chance to disappear or to atone. He wondered where she was now, whether she had found a place where memory did not demand payment every day. He did not imagine forgiveness would come easily for her. He did not imagine it should. But he hoped she would live long enough to decide what mercy meant on her own terms. Ethan sat on a low concrete barrier and watched the sea darken. Rex lay beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. The world beyond them continued as it always had, unaware of how close it had come to loss. That ignorance did not feel like injustice to Ethan anymore. It felt like the point. When the night finally settled, there were no voices in his head demanding answers, no echoes of command telling him what should have been done. There was only the quiet understanding that some acts were not meant to be celebrated, only survived. He would carry what he had done, and he would do it without applause. Rex yawned, rested his chin on his paws, and closed his eyes. Ethan stayed where he was, listening to the steady rhythm of the sea, allowing the silence to do its work. There were things that had been saved, lives that would continue without ever knowing why. And there were things that would never leave him, no matter how far he walked. Somewhere beyond the dark, the world turned on, unknowing and intact. There are things that are saved, and things that are never meant to be forgotten. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that God's miracles often arrive quietly and ask us to carry their weight, please like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can continue telling stories where faith, sacrifice, and silence speak louder than applause. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones that make noise. They are the ones that happen quietly, when someone chooses mercy over convenience, conscience over command, and love over fear. Maybe no one ever knew how close the world came to breaking. Maybe no headlines were written. But if even one life was spared, one family never felt loss, then something holy passed through that moment. In our own lives, we may never face battles like this. But every day, we are asked to choose who we become. When no one is watching, when doing the right thing costs more than doing the easy thing. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people, through quiet courage and unseen sacrifice, then this story is for you. Please share this story so its message can reach someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel. And subscribe to Angels in Uniform to walk with us through more stories of faith, service, and humanity. May God bless you, protect you, and grant peace to your home and your heart.